things like in Hollywood. Hey, you guys, welcome back. We are at a webinar series. We're welcoming you to our webinar series. If we haven't met, I'm Karen Mayer Cunningham, special education boss, training everyone that sits at the 504 IEP table to navigate and negotiate successful student outcomes. And today we have one of our super fan favorites, Dr. Mitchell Yell, a hearing officer from South Carolina, an author, an educator, a trainer, and we're always excited to have Dr. Yell. And tonight our very small question is, what is FAPE? And so, we litigate usually over two things, right? Child find and FAPE. Most of it's FAPE. And it's such a subjective word. It's like, how many colors of blue are there? And so we're going to just talk with Dr. Yell tonight, get some parameters around that, what it is, and then really kind of more important, what it ain't. Because I think sometimes we learn better from what it's not. And so, Dr. Yell, welcome. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here with you, Karen.
Yes. So when you are looking at cases or when you're training people, kind of, I have it's kind of funny. I went online and printed out from understood.org. And they have, what is FAPE? And it said FAPE. And I thought what was interesting and funny, not funny that it's free. And so I'm like, who is it free to? And so can we just kind of break down the acronym initially and kind of tell us what that means?
Yeah, sure. Well, free, of course, is parents are not required to pay anything out of pocket for whatever you put in the IEP. So if it's in the IEP, it's that public expense. And that's most of the law really has not changed since 1975, what a FAPE is. But FAPE is free now. Schools can do things like they can tap into insurance and Medicaid, I mean, but they can't charge parents for anything. So if you have that a child will have a certain piece of assistive technology in the IEP, that's at school district expense.
What if they don't want to?
If they want to pay for it?
If they don't want it, what if the school doesn't want to pay for it?
That's a problem. They need to. That's what the law says.
Yes. Okay, so that's the free.
That's the free.
What is appropriate?
That is the sticking point. What is appropriate? Well, what is appropriate for any given child will differ. What is appropriate for one child with a disability will not be appropriate for others. And so when Congress, this is kind of interesting, Karen, when Congress originally passed, it was then called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975. One of the authors of the law, which is a senator from Vermont named Robert Stafford, he later wrote an article for the Vermont Law Review in which he said, we deliberately didn't define FAPE. We couldn't define FAPE. The only people that can define FAPE are the experts, who are the parents and the school personnel working with the child. And so instead, what we did was create a baseline mechanism called the IEP. That is what is appropriate for any given child. So the appropriateness is defined by your IEP. So if I do a hearing on FAPE, as you said, majority are on FAPE, it always starts out with the IEP. So in essence, every case heard by the Supreme Court start out at the IEP table. And all of them have involved what is in that IEP. So that's what appropriate is.
Okay, and what is public?
Public just means preschool, from preschool, elementary, and secondary. From ages, Part B covers, depending on your state, most states from age 3 to when a child or student graduates, or if with a legitimate diploma. So if they don't graduate, it literally ends in most states at their 22nd birthday. That's the public part, and of course, education is academic. And we have to remember this too, is defined as not only academic achievement, but functional performance as part of education.
Okay. And then education includes, what does education include?
Well, it would include special ed services. that you write into the IEP, specially designed instruction for a child, related services, supplementary aids and services, program modifications, anything that the child needs in order to be educated. And that could be, again, not only academic, but functional, like maybe speech, behavioral programming. And, folks often say, well, what is functional? Well, Congress didn't really define that, except they said, here's what it's not. It's not academic. Everything else could be functional, but it's primarily communication, behavior, socialization, could be adaptive physical education, that's essentially what it is.
Okay. So I heard you say two things, which I love people that educate themselves, and just like all of us, we kind of lean into the piece that we find that is kind of what we're looking for, right? And so and you and I have talked about this. IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is respectfully an overreach, and I think part of that overreach is in fact the language. And the language, it says anything the child needs. That sounds like, well, I'm going on a cruise, it's all paid for, I get everything from the gift shop, and then we have to parlay that with appropriate. So kind of talk about anything the child needs and or versus appropriate. Where is that balance?
Well, a balance is essentially whatever the IEP team, which of course includes parents and the child's special ed teacher, an LEA rep, and a general ed teacher, whatever they decide the child needs in order to address his or her disability in a way that allows them or enables them to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances, as the Supreme Court recently said. In fact, that's another area I'm sure we'll probably talk about it, but because the definition isn't that clear, because it says appropriate basically is what we as IEP team members determine it is, it often resolves or leads to disputes between parents and school district personnel, and may lead to a due process hearing, may lead to a complaint to 504 or to the state. But the due process hearing then usually enters the federal court system if there are appeals. And so, like I said, every Supreme Court case, and there have been 14, depending on how you count, special ed cases heard by the Supreme Court. In two of them, they tried to define what FAPE was.
Can you talk about those two cases? I love to hear you train on those two cases.
Yeah, well, the first case was way back in 1982, and I was a master's student at the time, and I remember people were worried because they were worried that the Supreme Court could say this is an unconstitutional law, and then it would be thrown back to the states. Well, they didn't do that. But in the case involved Amy Rowley, who is now actually a professor of linguistics at I think she's at UC Berkeley, possibly, or UC Riverside, I believe. But anyway, she was profoundly deaf. Her parents were profoundly deaf. And there was this new law at the time, Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Parents were pretty excited that they could send Amy to a public school. The public school was pretty excited about it too. So they decided, they had an IEP meeting. And I mean, this is only a couple of years after the enactment of the law and the regulations. So they had an IEP meeting and they agreed on everything except a sign language interpreter. And that wound up being the gist of the case, or the grist of the case, that did Amy need a sign language interpreter to receive a FAPE? Well, the hearing officer said no, she doesn't. That was appealed then to the federal district court. This was in New York. They said yes, she does, because without a sign language interpreter, she will not be able to achieve to her maximum potential. And FAPE is really about equal educational opportunity and giving a child programming that allowed them to reach their maximum potential. It was then appealed to this U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, who agreed with the district court, and then the school filed what's called a petition for certiorari with the Supreme Court, and to, I suppose, everybody's surprised they decided to hear it. So in 1982, they ruled on Board of Education v. Rowley. And interestingly enough, Amy Rowley actually wrote an article a few years ago on the case. It was called Rowley Revisited. And what happened is the Supreme Court, and this is where a lot of folks in special ed were worried. They might say, well, this is an unconstitutional law because really education's the province of the states, not the federal government. And federal government, Congress being the smart folks that they were able to get around that by making Education for All Handicapped Children Act really a funding law. They said, state, here, if you do what we want you to do, you can have a piece of the pie. Up to 40% of your excess costs will be paid. Of course, that never happened. But at any rate, the Supreme Court did not they did grant the petition for certiorari. They heard the case, and they came up with a two-part test to determine if Amy was in fact receiving a FAPE. And the first part of the test is, did the school meet the procedures of the law? And our law is filled with procedures. And in fact, if anyone out there has problems sleeping at night, take the law to bed with you. It'll put you right to sleep. Very boring. But part of the law, Part B, is it's important for us because it tells us as educators and as parents our rights and responsibilities. Well, the Supreme Court took this case and they said the first thing is you need to follow the procedures. That's not hard to do. Although school districts still are challenged by some of the real difficult procedures, like prior written notice seems to be a challenge to a lot of school districts. But that's the first part, follow the procedures. The second part, they said, is a judge or a hearing officer essentially has to determine if the IEP was reasonably calculated to enable a child to make educational benefit. So that was the two-part test, procedures and substance, or benefit. Let me say benefit, procedures and benefit. So I, as a hearing officer, when my first case came on FAPE, after, it was like 2015, I had to use that two-part test to determine if the school had provided FAPE. Now, with Amy Rowley, they said, well, the school, Furnace Woods Elementary School in New York, had done a really good job of following the procedures. So they checked that off for the school district. School district failed. Then they looked at the second part, educational benefit. And that's where this case got a little bit difficult because Amy had 125 IQ. She was very academically able. She was not a typical special ed child. So they said, well, how can we determine if the IEP was reasonably calculated to enable Amy to achieve educational benefit? And they said, well, it must have been because she was passing from grade to grade. She was one of the top students in the class. And interestingly enough, there was a footnote where they said, but this only applies to Amy, this class to class, only Amy. And of course, that's not the way courts and hearing officers tend to often interpret it. So they would look at things like, well, is the kid with a disability passing from grade to grade? Are they passing all their classes? Well, yeah, then they must receive an appropriate educational benefit. And because of that, I think we had a lot of circuit courts. All the courts could pretty much handle the procedural stuff, but they really had a difficult problem with the educational benefit stuff. And so the circuit courts, which circuits started saying different things. Like the Fifth Circuit, your circuit in Texas, they said, well, it has to be meaningful benefit. And
Which is another word that we don't know what means.
Yeah, no, that's a real problem.
Yeah.
But a lot of them, like my circuit in the Fourth, were saying some benefit is all you need. The 10th Circuit even said a little more than trivial benefit is fine. In fact, a judge named Neil Gorsuch, who was on the 10th Circuit at the time, wrote a decision saying merely more than de minimis benefit is okay. And that means merely a little bit more than nothing is fine. Well, it was obvious Supreme Court had to eventually, because what they want to do is they want to settle disputes among the circuits. So it was obvious that they were going to hear a case again on the FAPE eventually. And in 2017, they heard one. It was called Andrew F. v. Douglas County School District, which you're well familiar with. And it only dealt with the second part of the two-part test. The procedural part of the test is still there, but they clarified the second part. And like you said, the whole question of benefit was confusing to the court. So they said, we're going to try and help you figure this out. And what they did is they changed or clarified the second part of the test. So the first part is you look at procedures. And the second part, you look at the IEP and you determine, was this IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances? Essentially meaning, progress is the court this was interesting. A friend of mine and myself actually heard the oral arguments in the case. And Justice Sotomayor was saying, well, we know what the idea wants. So the idea is about meaningful benefit. Our challenge is to come up with the right words to convince the court what other lower courts and hearing officers, what meaningful benefit means. And they chose the word progress because it implies moving forward. And so that's the state now. The state of play right now is, as school district personnel or as an advocate, if a case you have goes to a hearing officer like myself, and it's a FAPE case, we will ask the first test from Rowley. Did you procedurally follow the law school district? And then second, we'll ask the question Andrew, the Supreme Court said to ask, and Andrew is, was the IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances?
Right. So I love both of those cases, and there's so many different factors in those cases, and that's why when I sit in meetings and they say the group or all the other kids, I think one of the things I heard you train on for the Amy Riley case was she's the smartest kid in her class, right? She's a doctor now, so that's not usually, as advocates or special education committee members, that's not usually the student we're dealing with, and she only had one disability, just one. And I think if I remember right, the decision was the parents wanted her to maximize, or as I tell my people I train, never use the B word in a meeting. It's not best education. This is not, you're not writing somebody a check. And I think even the story about the interpreter, Amy wasn't having it, right? She was not having it in the classroom. And so kind of fast forward, and that is 2017 means 40 years of IDEA, I don't want to say this, but I'll say it, is kind of a slam dunk for school districts and attorneys, because talking about, the substantive requirement and the procedural violations, right? Did you follow the processes and what's the meat of the IEP, or as you said, the benefit, that's great. Before 1975, you didn't get to come on the property. So it wouldn't be hard for me to show a hearing officer. We went from nothing to he's in the building. And I've had, I'm sure you've seen it, due process is not fun. Nobody says Karen's amazing, Mitch is amazing, Alicia's amazing. It's not how it goes, right? And I've even had in due processes talking about a denial of FAPE about a child that can't read, and they will show some Hallmark card. Well, Mrs. Cox, didn't you send this to teacher Mr. Yell and tell him he was wonderful? And we'll have judges rule on that. Like, that's what nice people do. And so kind of talking about the Andrew story, which I love the Andrew story, in the great Colorado, which sometimes I think the air is too thin there. Kind of tell us about his IEP, and kind of, I've heard you train on this. We could have just stayed at the table, right? This was not like this was a one-off, or, Rachel's mad or Karen's mad. This was like a long time coming. So kind of talk about what was not FAPE and what was not being delivered as a FAPE in his IEP.
Well, that's really an interesting question. What the parents felt is he had been educated in actually in the Douglas County School District from the time he was from pre-K all the way to fourth grade. And Drew, as his parents called him, had a fairly severe autism, and it affected his behavior, his communication, his academics, obviously. Well, they felt he was doing okay until about third grade, and then his behavior started worsening, his academics sort of stalled, and the school district did not do much. The IEP team did not do much. And so in fourth grade, when they met, they essentially presented an IEP that contained many of the goals of the IEP the preceding year. Well, if you want to have any way to admit that this child has not made progress, that's the way to do it. Just repeat the goals from year to year. And they had a very, if any, behavioral program at all. So the parents said, well, we're out of here. If we're going to place our child in a private school, which they did, a private school, the Firefly Autism House, and Drew was educated there for the year. He did fairly well. His academics and reading, he was doing better. His behaviors were getting under control. And so the parents went back to the school district because they wanted Drew to attend the public school. They didn't want to continue paying 70 grand a year for tuition at the Firefly Autism House. And what the school did is came up with the IEP that was the same as the year before. Same goals, no behavior intervention plan. And so they said, gone. We're going to fire. We're pulling our child out. And not only did they pull him out, but they sued the school district. And they sued for tuition reimbursement, which the Supreme Court in a case did say that's available. If a school district does not offer FAPE and the parents have to pull their child and put him in a private school to receive a good education, they could sue for attorney's fees. They just have to prove the two things. One, school did not provide FAPE. Two, our private school is pretty good. And so Drew's parents went to a hearing and they lost. They went to they went to the next higher level, which is they appealed to federal district court. They lost. Then they appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, and they lost there too. And the reason they lost is because of that really low standard, that merely more than de minimis standard that Neil Gorsuch had written in a previous decision. And they then filed for certiorari, and to many people's surprise, the Supreme Court decided to hear the case. And that's when they clarified what educational benefit means. So they didn't actually what they did is they did something called reversing and remanding, which said they said this whole law no longer good. Here's our new law. You have to use this standard now. Progress appropriate. And they remanded it, which means they sent it back to the lower courts. The first court, the appellate court, sent it back to the district court. They kicked the can down the road. The district court went and overturned their decision and found in favor of Drew and his parents. The school district had to not only pay tuition, they had to pay prospective tuition. In fact, Drew, I believe, graduated last year. They had to pay tuition, 70 grand a year, every year for that. And they also had to pay for attorney's fees. And I found this, you never know what the attorney's fees are going to be, but unless they publicize it, well, we don't even know what Drew's last name was. But I was looking at the newspaper one time, and I found an article in which they said the school district, about the school board meeting at the Douglas County School District, they miraculously took $3 million out of their general fund for some unknown reason. But what it really was about paying what they should have been paying for all along. And that, by the way, is how courts will say. They won't say, monetary damages. They'll say tuition reimbursement. You're reimbursing the parents for what you should have been doing.
Right.
And in
That's
the court, it's kind of interesting too. The district court really focused on Drew's behavior
yeah,
in overturning their decision, saying the behavior the objectives weren't ambitious, they weren't challenging, and there was not much of a behavior plan in the IEP, and
just
so
had
they
an
found in favor.
IEP the other day, and it was past embarrassing. She had three goals. She can't read. She had never reading goal. One of her goals was that she would accept her accommodations in special ed. What? I mean, I can't make it up. And so I don't blame the boots on the ground, the teachers, the paraprofessionals. But you talked about rights, right? Those are afforded to the parent and the student with the disability, and responsibilities. So as it relates to FAPE, I think if you lined up 100 teachers and said, I'm going to give you $1 million if you can describe what FAPE looks like, when are we as school districts and counties and cities and states going to teach them that? I appreciate what we learned in college. That was 100 years ago, and may or may not have been applicable. What is the state requirement for teaching its special education providers that which is FAPE?
Well, I think largely most states, school districts, most states don't really require anything much in terms of saying what you have to do in your curriculum. But most legitimate special ed programs will have a law course, and most they'll have methods courses. And one of the big things I think that Andrew really puts emphasis on is writing measurable goals and actually collecting progress, monitoring data on those goals. And it's kind of an important thing that we understand, that the IEP FAPE doesn't guarantee success. What it guarantees is the school will do their best, make their best good faith efforts and offer programming, and then measure progress and make changes. That's what a school district's done. By the way, also implement the IEP as agreed upon. And that sometimes is a problem.
Yeah, something that you just tapped on, which um, when I'm in meetings, just as I've been in all my meetings, it seems like I have the IEP progress report, which often isn't even correct. I had an IEP progress report recently, and it said the student mastered her goal at 80 to 90 words correct per minute. I said, well, your PLAF said she reads 77 words correct per minute, and the goal was 95. And they said yes. And I'm not very good with math, but I feel like that's not right. And so, kind of let's talk about, and one of the things that I said, because I'm always setting it up for if we're going to file a state complaint, OCR, or due process. I just said, Mitch, he mastered this goal in May. Did you call the parents to, in any of these 4 grading periods, did you reach out to the parents to rewrite the IEP goal? No. And I hate doing it, but me, I'm trying to establish a fact in the recording and the deliberations. How is it for that teachers don't know that piece, that I have a duty to, if he's meeting it, well, we don't just keep meeting it, then there's no SDI.
Yeah.
How do they not know that little piece?
Um, Short answer to that is it's a mystery to me, because what now at the University of South Carolina, what we teach in South Carolina, at least at Clemson and the University of South Carolina, is that you collect data, you make your goals measurable, you collect data on it. If you determine the child is not making adequate growth, that they'll meet the IP, you have to make instructional changes. But if the child is making, and in fact, if they made it real early, one of the things you need to do is rewrite the goal, is make it even more ambitious. Because remember that's one of the things the Supreme Court said in the Andrew case is students should have challenging objectives. Well, it's not challenging to meet your objective or your goal the second week of the school year and then have the same goal, because you're not going
Exactly.
anywhere then.
Exactly. And any of you guys that don't already know about the Andrew decision, you just type it in ENDREW. F is in Frank versus Douglas County School, and it's an amazing decision. Additionally, OSEP, Office of Special Education Programs, has a question and answer document. That's how important it is. And just taking that document to meetings will really be helpful, because really that whole phrase that we are charged with writing, after we've reasonably calculated, I don't know if that takes more than 4 minutes, that we've reasonably calculated this IEP to make able a student to make progress, and kind of talk about the progress, because that was the first time that sort of landed on the doorstep of the schoolhouse. But before that, it was like we let them in and we're doing better than, basic floor of opportunity, right? So what does it mean for, Mrs. Smith to enable Billy to make progress?
That's really important. And I think one of the things he hit on too is back when I was teaching, and back in 1975 when the law was passed, it was really about access because kids didn't have access. Kids with disabilities didn't have access. I mean, I don't remember any children with disabilities in my elementary school growing up, or even my middle school, because they could be routinely excluded. The school
Yeah.
could decide, a principal could decide, I'm not going to have kids with mental handicaps in my school. We don't have the ability to educate them. They're on their own. So or when it was first Education for All Handicapped Children was really about access. But along the road, as the law was generally being reauthorized every 6 years or so, it started to change. It's changed from being an access law to a goal, progress-oriented law, accountability law. In fact, I would say the first real steps to making it accountability law occurred way back 1997 in a reauthorization. And then if you look at 2004, when it was reauthorized again, what was the name of reauthorization? Was the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. It was
Yeah.
about improving the education of youngsters with disabilities. Now, the law stopped because it hasn't been reauthorized since 2004 and probably won't be soon, but it's still really about accountability. And Andrew has really, I think, upped the requirements by saying, well, what that means is you have to write an IEP that enables the child to make progress. And you have to be able to show that progress. And the way we do it is by writing measurable goals and then actually measuring them and reporting to parents how children are doing. And if children aren't on a track to meet their goal, changing instruction in some way.
We talk about for a minute, you know, I'm all about the details, and I believe that you win or lose a case, unfortunately, about the details and what's in writing. I always tell people it's three things, right? The evaluation, the IEP progress reports, and the IEP. So as I sit in hearings, I'm not the ones litigating them, but I partner with the law firm. We have, Mitchell doesn't like Karen, Karen doesn't like Mitchell, Alicia was mean to us, and all that. The hearing officer listens to it, but I don't think that has any, like, what does the document say? And so, kind of talk a little bit about, and I love teachers. Teachers have changed my life. They changed my son's life that was in special ed. They walk on water. They're paid bupkis, right? But talk about a teacher when they're looking at delivering FAPE, and how much of that IEP goal is the specifics of the language important when they track it.
Well, and I think I was a teacher for 16 years
Yeah.
myself in special ed, so I'm well aware of that. And I'm well aware of this. I think most teachers, I mean, I've analyzed through different grants, probably 1,000 IEPs. And one of the things I find without fail is most goals aren't measurable. You can't measure them. So they don't collect data on them. They don't even try to measure them. In fact, most goals, I think, are written in a way that no one really ever intended to measure them. And not because they don't want to, I think because they don't know how. And it's actually a fairly easy process. And once you have that down, there are tons of really good tools on measuring progress that aren't expensive, that are in most cases free,
Yeah.
that are very easy to administer. But the thing is, you have to really write goals and then actually that are measurable and then actually measure them. And it's not difficult, and then make changes based on the student's data.
I was in
And that's also very difficult.
yeah, in a meeting the other day, and to be there all the other day because it's been 2 years ago, and the teacher said, well, these are the goals I got. And I wanted to say, it's March, right? So talk about, like, if you get if you're the new teacher in 7th grade and it's Mitchell Yale, Leash Cox, and you got this IEP and it's not appropriate for the kiddo, I think teachers think that, well, I can't change it. Tell us about what they can do if you find that it's not appropriate based on the child that shows up in your classroom.
Okay, well, what you can do is call the parent and say, we need to have an IEP meeting and rewrite this IEP. I mean, you can have as many IEP meetings as you want. A parent can ask for IEP meetings at any time and get together and rewrite the IEP with the team. And actually, you can make a number of changes, just the teacher and the parent working together. As long as the team agrees to it, that can be an amendment to the IEP. You can change the goals, say if they're not challenging enough, make them more challenging.
When you're doing cases, um, what's the first oops? What's the biggest oops that schools make? I think it's interesting that when attorneys do trainings for school districts, they use the word misstep. I use the word illegal. Say whatever. So, what is the the mistake, the misstep that you see most often by school-based members?
Okay, in FAPE cases, I would
Yes.
say, well, I would say the biggest mistake is writing goals that are not measurable,
Okay.
because you can't measure them and you can't determine what a child's progress is. But that's what the Andrew case said, is we have
Right.
to enable a child to make progress appropriate. Well, if we can't do that, that's a real problem. Another problem, so we have teachers aren't good at writing measurable goals. Teachers are not good at collecting data or using data to make instructional changes. Another area is that too often I see present levels of performance that are very poorly done.
Yeah.
And I mean, one court actually compared that to the foundation of a house. And they said if the foundation's bad, eventually the house is going to fall down. And so if you got to have a bad assessment, the foundation of the IEP, you're going to have a bad IEP.
Right, right. So, what are some things that parents could look for as lay people? I know this is a big question to see if their documents right. And I'll just go for me. When my son started special ed, I was in trauma. It was traumatic. My life was traumatic. I literally said when he was 3 years old, if he eats the sheetrock, are you going to kick him out? That was my first meeting because that's what he was doing at our house. And they said no. And I was like, oh, that's good. But I just thought he was going to be in trouble, right? And most people come from a general ed student, you're going to be in trouble. So, what is it? Most parents, as you know, do go without representation or support. And it becomes a little bit clinical. So, if you're a parent, what are you looking for in this document that is so easy to read that really, spotlights your.
Well, I would say first off, do you think the present levels of performance address all the child's areas of need? And if it doesn't, parents should not be just informed about an assessment at the IEP meeting. They have to give the permission to assess a child, and they should be involved. What do you think your child's needs are? Where should we be assessing? That's one thing they can do. Another thing is make certain all those needs are actually included in the present level statement.
Yeah.
Because if they're in that foundation, they have to address it. Because if you have a need in the present levels, you have to have a service to address it. And if it's going to be a situation which use specially designed instruction for academics or behavior, then you need to have a goal. So I would say first thing, make certain assessment addresses all needs. Then second, two, make certain all the needs are expressed in the present level statement. And then think about, okay, this present level statement, how are we going to address all these needs? If it's math and reading, it'll probably be specially designed instruction, maybe resource room or something like that. That
Right.
needs a measurable goal. And that's the third part really, is determining if goal is measurable. Here's the way I always tell parents and teachers you cannot the only way you can measure if a goal, you can determine if a goal is measurable, is ask the teacher to graph it. Where
Right.
does the child start? Where are they going to be? And they, if they say something, well, we're going to measure at the end of the year one time, say, how do you graph? How are you going to graph that? Or if they have a goal and they don't have a present level that has any data in it, how do you know where the goal is going to go? So that's 3, I'd say measurable goal. And then 4 would be, well, now how are you going to measure it and how often are you going to report to me on my child's progress?
Right. I like
And
goals. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say 5th then, if they're saying not so much progress, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah. Perfect. I like goals that are you can't see. Like
Yeah.
Billy will use his strategies to not yell. Okay, I'm using those strategies every day in an IEP meeting. Do you know how many times? I mean, I can't even
No,
quantify that. So
no.
I am very simple, not like everybody else. I just literally read it out loud to myself when I'm prepping it before a client. If it doesn't make sense to me, because I think that even a long time ago, we could have agreed it was supposed to pass the stranger test, right? If you, me, and everybody else picked it up, we would do almost the same thing. And some goals are either like, I'll take a grilled cheese sandwich. I don't even know what they're talking about. And some are the Gutenberg Bible. They're just like in the beginning, right? I'm like, we just add during leap year. There's just so much information. So what is a way that schools can stay out of having to talk to you or present a case to you?
Well, I guess identify those extremely, what are the child's needs, and once you have those done, how are you going to address them? So every need has to have a corresponding service. And oftentimes when I find IEPs or that are not valid, it's because there's a need, but there's nothing to address that need. There's no service to address it. And it could be a specially designed instruction, could be related services, could be supplementary aids and services, but you have to have a service to direct every need. So you're saying, here's the child's needs. Now, teachers, this is what we're going to do about it in
Right.
every area. There's a fabulous resource available to teachers, and parents could use it too, called the Progress Center. I mean, if
Yes.
you put Progress Center in Google, you or in whatever browser you use, you will come up. That will be one of the first hits. Actually, the URL, it's promotingprogress.org. They have one pagers that are great, I think, and explain these things and really do a really nice job. There are a number of really good federally funded centers, lots of free information available to teachers. And then there are a lot of set places like Intervention Central that have tons of free resources available on in what they call their CBM warehouse, curriculum-based measurement
Right.
warehouse. So a lot of good information available to teachers and students. But we also need school districts have to understand they're responsible for keeping, their teachers up to date to providing good in-service professional development.
Awesome. And just in case you don't know, Dr. Yell travels all over the world teaching parents but mostly school-based members and conferences. So certainly if you ever want to reach out to him, he can get you that information. But he is amazing to train districts, staff, and any body that needs information around IDEA or 504. So I'm sure we have one question in the chat, Alicia. So we read that one question.
1 out of 29, absolutely. Okay. Can a public school legally not provide speech services that are listed on the IEP? The school is telling the parents they are short-staffed, so they cannot provide the speech services at this time.
Well, let me just say this. So far, Karen and I have been talking about, think of 3 dimensions or 3 buckets of FAPE. There are 3 parts of FAPE. There's procedural, we talked about that. There's the substantive, we talked about that. But there's also the implementation dimension. That means whatever you agree upon at the IEP meeting, that's what the school has to do. Now, courts like your circuit court have said, well, yeah, implementation is extremely important. Now, in most circuits, it's so important that even if the child makes educational progress. If you fail to implement, that could be a FAPE error.
Right.
So that's really important. Now, with respect to speech, we know, I mean, schools are clobbered by teacher shortages and the difficulty of getting teachers and SLBs, speech and language folk. But the idea doesn't really have any, doesn't say, well, unless you can't get a person, you have to provide the services you'd said you'd provide. Now, sometimes that'll require doing something in a, you know, being a little creative in how you actually provide those services. I know we have a similar problem with speech and language services in our more rural areas of South Carolina. And so what they're doing is some of the school districts that are really have problems have said, yes, we understand it's a problem. Here's what we're going to do about it. Here's how we're going to fix it. And a number of our really, really rural areas have gone to speech services. I mean, that's not ideal, but it's something. And you can't just do nothing. You have to do something.
You can't just do nothing. Yeah.
And by the way, this implementation, that's one of, I would say within probably a few years, we might be seeing a Supreme Court case on that. Because we have one circuit that's kind of a little outlier, and you might guess, Karen, it's your circuit.
No.
Yeah, they say in your circuit, they say in a decision called the Bobby R decision, they said essentially, well, implementation, yeah, if the child still makes growth, then it's not a big problem. Well, all the other circuits saying it's a problem. Child doesn't make progress and you didn't implement, it's still an error. It's a FAPE error, but not your circuit doesn't do that. So it could be if any other circuits decide we're going to do what the Fifth Circuit does, you're going to see the Supreme Court probably taking up the issue.
Thank you so much. What is FAPE if there isn't an IEP? If you cannot get a child to be found eligible?
Okay, well, Karen could talk about that. If a child with a disabilities is not eligible, and remember, to be eligible, they have to have a disability that's included in the IEP. Well, you know, that's pretty subjective. So like a learning disability, but we have to put children in one of those 13 disability categories. And also they need to require special ed services. So if a child has a disability, but doesn't require services, they may not be eligible for IDEA, but they will almost certainly be eligible for Section 504 services. Because 504, and Karen, I know, does a lot of these, picks up those kids with disabilities. I mean, all kids under IDEA are doubly covered under 504,
Right.
but there are kids in the school who are 504 only students.
Okay, thank you. Is a district in violation of FAPE for providing speech and language 5 minutes a month consult with a goal when the speech language evaluation found the child to have a functional communication?
Okay, so they have a goal, but do they have a service, and their service was 5 minutes a month of consult?
Yeah. They have a goal, but they
I
have
would say
5
no.
minutes of consult.
I would say that is not good. What the parent should probably do in that case is ask for another IEP meeting. You know, is the child making progress? Probably not, because that's kind of a loose term, consultation. What does that mean exactly? And 5 minutes a month of it, what's that? How is the child going to benefit that way? So I would say the parent, if it's a parent, I would ask for another IEP meeting and ask for more services.
Yeah, because the law says I have a disability, and because of that disability, I'm in need of specially designed instruction, not for somebody to talk to another adult. So adults talking to adults, I'm not really smart, but that's not specially designed instruction. So I'm all for consult. Y'all can consult away, but you're going to need time to mitigate this need. So if it's a couple of adults talking, and I will say it in the meetings, then let's DNQ him. Miss Cunningham. That's when you know you're right, when they say Miss Cunningham. So I have a disability. It's just child fine. And based on that disability, I'm in need of special education and or related services. I am in need of it, the child with a disability. And there's a great, you might know her. I don't know her name, but she is a teacher in the Bronx, and she's hysterical. And she said one day on social media, she goes, consult, that's just adults playing tiddlywinks. I've never said that at a meeting, but I have thought it.
Okay, a parent wants their child to go to college. The student is probably able to go to college, but does the IEP have to be written to ensure they are ready for college, or just ensure they're making progress in light of their disability?
Well, the federal law, the idea requires that age 16, the IEP has to include transition planning to help them transition to post-school life. And that could include college, but that's up. Then what you have to do then is you have to invite the child who, by the way, and I should back up, the idea says 16, most states require it at 14. My state, South Carolina, actually 13 and a half. And what you have to do in a transition IEP is you have to have the child there. You have to ask the child to be there. You have to ask a representative of any agency that might be involved to be there. Maybe you want your child to go to the local technical school, asking that person to be part of the transition plan and develop a plan for the child to help them transition to that post-secondary school environment. So yeah,
Perfect.
you do have to address it.
Thank you so much. How is an accommodation defined on the IEP? Is it supplemental aid, a service, or an instructional strategy?
Well, really, an accommodation usually is what we call a supplementary aid and service, or it could be a program modification. They're really what a supplementary aid and service is. It's really accommodation to help the child be educated in the general education classroom, or to be educated with their non-disabled peers. Program modifications can also be accommodations that you make to the child's program to help them be involved. And I know, Karen, you've seen tons of 504 plans that just include accommodation after accommodation that make no sense at all.
Right.
So it's very important that accommodations really need to be linked to the present levels. What accommodations does this child really need? I find the more accommodations that are included in the IEP, the less likely they are to be implemented.
See, said that. Yeah.
He did say it. Okay. My 8-year-old autistic son's district is only offering 30 minutes of individual speech per week and 30 minutes of group speech per week, yet his lack of communication skills has negatively impacted his reading, social skills, and behavior. He has not made significant progress with the plan over the last 2 years, so I requested additional speech minutes during our annual review. The team flat out ignored the request and left the services the same. They ignore most of our input, actually. Is this a denial of FAPE, and what can I do?
Well,
Can I address that just real quick? So I heard a couple of things. So you have to remember there's 3 different models, right? There's a medical model, there's a therapeutic model, and there's an educational model. If I understood the question correctly, she's getting speech twice a week for about 30 minutes. We have to remember in school, to get more of this, I'm losing some of that, right? That is that meaningful benefit, harmful effect. We don't have a lot of data in a public school setting to support that if I gave you more speech, there would be a quicker mitigation of that deficit, right? They should consider your input. The other thing that I heard was significant progress. And there is nowhere under the law, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mitchell, that says significant. We're right up there with best. And so it should be appropriate, right, in light of their unique circumstances, which have ambitious goals. But I also want to caution people, because a lot of people will do this in compensatory time. We're just going to get a bunch more speech and a bunch more whatever. Well, I always say the child has to do the time. So what is appropriate in a public school setting for the student who needs special ed and related services and instructional services to make progress? And it's really a combination. I don't have children that have more than 2 speech sessions a week. I just don't. because it means I've got to take them away from something else. I want those sessions to be meaningful. So maybe I would unpack, is Mitch the speech pathologist with 82 kids in there? Is Mitch the speech pathologist with a child that has a severe speech impairment, a child that stutters, and a child that just has articulation issues? Doesn't have a good group? Does Mitch have a kindergartner and 2 fifth graders? Maybe kind of tease out what that is. I would say it's a good amount of time, but why isn't that time producing the outcomes we want? So I just want to share that, Mitch.
No, I think that's perfect answer. I think, yeah, absolutely. I have not seen many IEPs that include more speech than that. One of the things you might want to do is, in addition to the speech means, can the speech person provide it? It's just consultation term again, but can they provide some assistance to general education teachers to help the child with their communication?
And I would also ask, and this is what I ask at a meeting, can you tell me what you're doing with Jude so that mom and dad can reinforce what you're doing? And sometimes really well-meaning, very smart people are doing the wrong thing. Or maybe Jude's private speech pathologist is doing something totally different. So we have just drained his cognitive load and he's like, I'm out. Right. So we all want to make sure that we're all speaking the same kiddo based on their needs, which is always moving. So I will just say, so tell me what you're doing in OT so we can reinforce that. And sometimes I'm gonna go, there's a reason you're not finding the gains that we were looking for.
Perfect. See what I did there? Okay, sorry.
My favorite phrase.
It is. A new student to my class. He has an off-campus psych evaluation. On it, it lists ADHD, ADD, ODD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, anxiety, quick to anger, self-harm, and has not been in class since early January. He was assessed and is 3 years below grade level in ELA or the 3rd percentile in ELA, 5th percentile in math. He has 1 accommodation on his 504 small group testing. I would love next steps. I want to do whatever you suggest. I know he needs an IEP. He has been in my class less than a week, and I want what is best for him. Thank you.
So it sounds like you're the teacher, and it sounds like you're amazing and you're ethical. So any of us have a duty, onus, and obligation to refer them for special education testing. So we've blown right past child fine because there's not a suspected disability. So I would go to your amazing leadership and say, we need to get this kiddo tested and somebody needs to reach out to the parents.
Yeah, absolutely. You have every public school should have a referral mechanism where you can go fill out a referral and get the process rolling. And I think you should do that as soon as you can.
Amen. Hallelujah. All right. What does transportation for our kids to and from school? Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Let me restart that. Why does transportation for our kids to and from school fall under FAPE?
Well, it falls under FAPE if it's in the IEP. If a child is receiving education in not the home school, they're another school, they have to be bused. That becomes a related service, and that becomes part of FAPE because it's part of the child's IEP, and of course the IEP is a blueprint of his or her FAPE.
Perfect. Are extracurricular activities included in FAPE?
The short answer is yes, they are. Now, extracurricular activities, if you determine a child needs to participate, yeah, you can put that in the IEP. A number of years ago, there was a OCR issued a letter on that, a dear colleague letter that people were just all up in arms because they're saying essentially kids with disabilities have the same right to participate in extracurricular activities. And I think people then said that, does that mean they have to be on the football team? No, it doesn't. It means they have to be given an opportunity. But as we know, some extracurricular activities take a certain skill set, like being on the football team. And if they can't make it, they can't make it. So, but they have to be given the opportunity to try out. Additionally, you can't I read, and I remember reading an IEP one time that said the child will be the quarterback on the football team. Well, that you can't do that because, that's a process where you try out. And so, but extracurricular activities should be included, counseling, all those sorts. Anything that's extracurricular could be included in the IEP, but it only is for participation. You can't say they're going to be on a team.
Yeah, I think Alicia and I just did a call or something about this just a few days ago. And the parents wanted, there were a couple of girls that were in life skills, had intellectual disabilities, and they didn't make the cheerleading team, but they wanted to have their own separate little cheer team and let them participate. If you didn't make the team, you didn't make the team. So it's not discrimination based on disability. They're like Dr. Yells, there's a skill set. I don't have it, right? And so sometimes we get into discriminatory practices by letting some of those things occur. I had a school district one time, which I jumped in the middle and stopped it. And they let this child that had a disability and life skills shoot the ball for 90 seconds at halftime until he made a goal. I was like, y'all need to stop that. And it was just little town USA. They were trying to be nice, but that's not appropriate either. I mean, UIL is UIL, and there are requirements to try out.
Perfect. Thank you. Is the
Oh, by
Supreme
the way, I do want to say one other thing though. Physical education is included in FAPE also. We often don't think of that, but there are good programs across the country and educators who are prepared in adapted PE or adapted physical education. That could be part of an IEP too.
Yes,
And it's not part of an IEP in Kentucky. Just so you know that. I was like, well, that's why you've never won the Super Bowl. That's what. Do you think I said that, Alicia?
yes, I did. Yes. If the state Supreme Court has ruled de minimis is okay for gen ed students' education, what does that mean for Andrew F. and students with IEPs?
Probably nothing, because students with disabilities do have this thing we've been talking about, this right to a free, appropriate public education. States have their own, I mean, there's really no federal law saying that a child without disabilities needs a FAPE. I mean, there are things like the Every Student Succeeds Act, but they're not the depth of rights and responsibilities that we have as special educators to kids with disabilities, to general education students. So probably no effect.
And what state says that?
I know, I want to know too. Okay. When you are referencing the
Probably South Carolina. Actually, South Carolina did at one time have some really bad language. Like it would be like a minimum education sort of thing. So I'm sorry I interrupted. What were you saying?
I keep like double hitting the mute button and like unmuting and muting myself again. Okay, when you're referencing the 2017 case and talking about progress, are you talking about progress in the child's disability or progress in all areas in the curriculum or based on the child's intellect level?
Well, that's an interesting question, because the term was progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. And essentially what most people would say the Supreme Court was saying there is you need to assess a child's disability and determine what is appropriate for the child. How can they, what does progress look like for any given child? One really good source I would refer teachers and parents to is understood.org used to have what they called the Andrew Toolbox. And I found it was on there and then suddenly it wasn't. So I talked to someone at Understood and they said, oh goodness, that should still be on there. So I haven't checked lately, but it's really good because it's literally a script for parents to take into IEP meetings using the language of Andrew F.
It's on there. They must have listened to you, Mitch.
Well, I know as often than not again. I just haven't checked for it lately.
Perfect. What is the school district's obligation? I feel like we may have answered this one earlier in a different question, but I'll ask it again and y'all decide. What is the school district's obligation for transition in regards to FAPE?
Okay, yeah, I think we did answer that. It's depending on your state, but it probably, if your state is like most, it will say at age 14 you have to include transition planning in the student's IEP. You have to do a transition assessment, which you address or assess a child's skills and abilities and interest, and then you have to develop a transition plan based on that assessment. So it's very similar to the IEP process, and there's really no reason to have a separate process. It's part of the IEP process.
Perfect. Okay, this one says, I'm new to this arena, but was a nurse for 30 plus years. I'm struggling to help my nephew with Downs, and I just reviewed his IEP. I see the same statements, quote unquote, behavior impacts his ability to learn, but in the entire document, I see no specific goals, no methods to help him reach those goals, and no behaviorist eval since 2022, which was when his initial eval was. Essentially, the same comments for the last 2 years. How or where can I find info on what a well-written IEP should look like? Comparing an IEP to a nursing care plan, I would expect specific steps and what the outcomes of the steps should be. Am I off base to expect the same level of that word in an IEP?
Specificity. Yeah,
Yeah.
you should require that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would urge you to go on to the Progress Center and look at some of their IEP material, because that whole center, their goal there is, or their purpose is to put free resources to parents, to teachers, to help them write high quality IEPs. And yeah, you absolutely have a right to expect that. And go to your the child's IEP meetings and help that way. But you can clearly expect, think back to what we talked about before. Make certain they're assessing all of a child's needs. Make certain all the needs are addressed in that assessment. And if the child has needs that are not being addressed, insist that they assess in those areas. Make certain the present levels of performance in the IEP addresses all those needs. And then every need that is in the IEP has to have a service, and most of them will have goals.
I just want to say, as it relates to a child that has a disability of Down syndrome, I almost every child that I've ever advocated for or represented, the most insufficient part of their IEP was identifying and addressing their language deficit. So it's my experience that the biggest gap we have in life, period, as adult anywhere, is our ability to communicate with one another. And so if I can't communicate with you, I might get irritated and might have behaviors. So there's always a reason for that behavior outcome. Our job is to find out what is the reason. Does he not understand? Is he confused? Was he not ready to stop what he was doing? Is what you're giving him too hard for him to achieve in what you're asking him to do? He's not just having a behavior in a vacuum. And so when we identify the function of that behavior, that evaluation is called the functional behavior assessment, then we have more information to serve the committee, but more importantly, to equip this child to be successful.
Perfection. We only have 874 more questions.
Oh, good.
No big deal. This one I thought was funny, so I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit because it was cute. It says, Karen just used an acronym, SDI. Could she spell it out for us? Because I don't recognize it.
Specially designed instruction. It's the same word as special education. It's what am I going to do special above the general education teacher to help the student make expected progress on his IEP goals. It's a secret sauce. It's the coaching, right?
Correct. How can a school district and a parent figure out the student's LRE?
LRE, least restrictive environment, one of the acronyms we toss around probably too often. Every school has to have something called the continuum of alternative placements. And that's a continuum that way at the top it has the general ed setting, and way at the bottom is homebound and institutional, and there's steps in between. And what the task of the actually placement team, in most cases the IEP team, is to determine where can the child receive an appropriate education, and then what's the LRE? What is the least restrictive appropriate setting for a child? Because number one, you determine what a child needs. Number two, you determine where you can educate them. And that education has to be to the maximum extent appropriate with non-disabled children. And, I'll never see, I've seen LRE cases before. I've never seen one on resource room, because generally when a child goes into a resource room or a speech room, that's not considered more restrictive. That's legally basically a supplementary aid and service to keep the child in the general ed setting. So that's not a more restrictive setting. But some settings are a little more restrictive, like a special class where they spend 50% of their day or so. In that case, if a child can only be educated appropriately there, in that setting, you have to determine, well, where can we make certain that we have some integrated experiences?
But Mitch, I'm going to ask you a question, and it makes me crazy when I'm in meetings and people are like, "I've got to get Billy back to his LRE." Well, LRE is not a location; it's a consideration. And I bet if you lined up 100 teachers and gave them a lie detector test, 99 would say LRE is the general ed classroom. So, can you tell us how that happened? We'll call it misinformation. And like somehow I think teachers feel like they failed if a student doesn't stay in their classroom.
Yeah, the LRE doesn't refer to a specific place at all. LRE means two things really. It means one, to the maximum extent appropriate. We're going to educate kids with disabilities with kids without disabilities. And secondly, that only if we cannot provide education in a least restrictive setting with supplementary aid services like, say, resource room, can we move them to more restrictive settings. But even in those cases, we still have to make integrated, have integrated settings as much as possible. Maybe it's in PE, maybe it's in lunch, but you have to always consider that to the maximum extent appropriate, kids with disabilities should be educated alongside kids without disabilities.
You should go back and record that and then tattoo it on y'all's arm, what he just said. LRE doesn't even say general education is LRE. It's gold. Sometimes I feel like we should hold up like little ping pong paddles with the words, "You're wrong, you're wrong."
Y'all are cute. Okay. I work at a public separate school where it's primarily the district students who exhibit the most challenging behaviors. When another school in our district is considering an LRE change to our public separate school, is it predetermination if myself or another rep from our school is at the IEP meeting?
No, predetermination only occurs when you as school district personnel make a decision about program or placement without the parents. Now, I was a teacher for 16 years in emotional disabilities, and I had a lot, sometimes it's very difficult to get the parents, sometimes very difficult even to identify them. I still had to have that responsibility, but if you can involve the parents, you have to. So predetermination doesn't occur unless you've made a decision without the parents.
So would calling you going, "Hey, Mitch, just want to give you the heads up, your son, Bob, he's going to blah, blah, blah." Just wanted to let you know that.
Can't do that.
Okay. Just
that would be predetermination.
The old heads up. Yeah.
All right. Is it a FAPE issue if a parent asked for raw data collection sheets and the school said we cannot get any data prior to October 20th, 2023? They say that they were not required to compile it prior to that date.
I don't know where they came up with that. Old cloth, I guess. That's been really a requirement since 1975 that you have some sort of objective way to collect progress data on a child. And now it became much more important as of 1997 and with the Ender decision, but it had nothing to do with October 2023, you
Just a
said?
couple weeks ago, because we saw Karen on social media and
No, that I don't know where that would come from. Absolutely not true.
That was a fun question. Okay. In a recent IEP evaluation, my daughter had the school included a list of quote unquote recommendations for considerations at the end of the evaluation that included counseling or social work services to address declining self-esteem symptoms of depression, anxiety, and executive functioning skills. Executive functioning skills are key to my daughter is struggling with. She was denied an IEP, and when we asked about executive functioning skills being taught as part of her 504 plan, the school said they cannot offer that to her because it's only available with an IEP. If they found that she needs this, can they deny her these services?
Did you want to take that one, Karen?
you take that one.
Okay. No, again, this is one of those, I have no idea where they came up with that because there's nothing in the regulations of 504 or idea that say that. So I take it the child has not been determined eligible in special ed education. And you're saying that you need a 504 plan. Well, the 504 plan is defined in the regulations to 504 is special education and related services that will allow a child to essentially achieve an education equivalent to that given to kids without disabilities. So that would be something they could do on an IEP, or I mean on their 504 plan. I'm assuming that by executive functioning teaching, not sure exactly what you mean there. But that would be an area where if you had some expertise in the school district, that perhaps you could do consultation with the general ed teachers. Did you have any particular feedback on that one, Karen?
I would like to locate on the map where all this stuff comes from. It's got to be the same place. So here's the thing. I think that, one of the things that we see is, we're looking for an identified need, right? Executive functioning training, you need to first have a disability, right? You got to have a disability. So, and then based upon that disability, I need special education and related service, right? That could be under that. But I think often what happens in evaluations is they're terrible. They're insufficient, they're inadequate. I had an evaluation the day that had 20 pages for OT, and it was like 25 pages, the whole evaluation. It was so lopsided, right? We have to evaluate in all of those 8 areas. And if I didn't test for stuff, I'm not going to find the stuff. So, one of the things that we train on is that the F still stands for full and full individualized evaluation, not what you think is going on, but we test in all areas to rule it in or rule it out. And almost always when I see a situation like that, we did poor testing, or we did testing that sort of tracked with what mom and dad wanted. I think he struggles with reading. His uncle struggled with reading. And really it's, he has ADHD, right? Which would impact your reading, right? And sometimes we ask for the wrong thing and we get these very pitiful evaluations that don't give us a good directive for a child.
Perfect. Okay, 72 to go in 29 minutes. We got this. Any suggestion of what to do if the district never provides nor shares data to show that the student has or has not met a goal?
So data is part of a student's educational records. It's one of your procedural rights that you have the right to review, examine, and sometimes receive a copy of your student's records. They're not the school's records. Sorry, that's shocking. They're the student with the disabilities records. I've had teachers go, those are mine. They're not, Muffin, right? They're not yours. And so to deny parents an opportunity to see the data that you made decisions on would also be not meaningful. So I assume the school makes decisions based on data. And so the parents have the right to meaningfully participate in the IEP process. So show me the data.
Yeah. And I'd also say probably when you're hearing that kind of thing, that is code for we don't have any data.
We didn't take any.
my good old teacher self would take those data collections and make a chart. And when they said he's not making progress, I'd pull the chart out and be like, "Are you sure? Because your data says he is." Anyway, sorry. That's me. Okay. In reading our present IEP, I noticed that many of my son's present levels of academic performance refer to testing that took place during our triennial in November 2022. Am I incorrect in believing that the tests from 2022 do not accurately represent present levels, especially absent any current data being presented?
I mean, I would say, a good evaluation is you could pull that forward at a present level. When I train people, I'm going to pull those cognitive pieces forward because your cognition stabilizes at 10. So is that the present level because I did the test presently? No, but many of those things aren't going to move because I keep testing. But always you want to pull essential parts of the last FIE into those present levels. So you can say, "Hey, Billy, just want you to know his processing's in the 7th percentile. No need to yell at him. He has low blood pressure. He takes longer to process." And so we're always sharing that with every new committee so they get appropriately serve him, but not necessarily do new evaluations provide you a better way to teach a student. It's all of those components, right? What happens during the day? What happens in transition? What happens in class? What happens at lunch? Who is he karate chopping at recess? What happens at car pickup line? What's happening with grandma at home? All of those pieces are his present levels. And so we're always looking to map that out in the puppy pristine prescriptive class so that we don't miss any area of need.
Yeah, and probably too, most schools give tests, quite a bit of tests. A lot of schools around here give the MAP tests, measures of academic progress, a couple times a year. So you do have that you can draw on. Now, those are status tests and really aren't really great for progress monitoring, but they're good for giving an indication of where disability or where a child's problems
Speaking of
are.
tests, the other day I was in a meeting. That should be a t-shirt that I sell. And they were talking about the amazing Texas and the amazing state test. I said, well, let me just jump in here. Let me just say shame on Texas that 44% and 48% is anything to pat yourself on the back about. So that's a shame on Texas thing. Because I'm pretty sure when I went to school in a covered wagon, 44, there would be an answer when I got home. Like nobody's going, "Yeah, did it." I don't know. Like if you went to work 44% of the time, would you have a job? So be very careful what we're talking about as an assessment and really quantify what does that mean.
Okay, perfect. Let me see. When I call a new IEP meeting, do all the goals reset to a year from that date?
Generally, a goal should have a timeline. I mean, properly written goals will have a few elements. And in special education, one of these elements is a timeline. The goal has to be for 1 year's time. And so essentially, 36 weeks, where is the child going to be at the end of the year? So in that sense, that part of the goal does change.
Okay, perfect. Someone is asking, you mentioned a progress website. They're wanting to know what that was.
It's promotingprogress.org, one word, promotingprogress.org. And that's the Progress Center. That center was set up by the Office of Special Ed Programs and funded by the office to help teachers to develop high quality IEPs. It's a really good website, a lot of good information on it, on IEP development.
Would that also be the same thing as the tools that you mentioned to make IEP goals be measurable?
No, not really. One of the things in terms of making IEP goals measurable, there's certain things you really need to get in a goal. One thing is you need a target behavior, and Karen was talking about it's got to be a visible target behavior. It's got to be something you can count or see happening. It can't be like enjoying or understanding. What does that mean? Not much in terms of a goal. It also has to have a criterion for acceptable performance. how many words do you want the child to read in order to meet the goal? Say, if you're doing an oral reading fluency goal, how many words a minute do you want them to read? Or you're doing a letter goal on capital letters in letters in general, how many letters should they be able to read within a certain amount of time? And that would be your criterion of acceptable performance. Then you need to have a given. That means given what? Given a story started in 3 minutes to write, or given a worksheet of randomly selected upper and lower case letters, how many will the child be able to identify? So you have to have all those elements available in a goal to really make them measurable.
Here's one of the kiss of deaths that I see in bad goals. He will improve his understanding of.
Yeah.
What?
Mm-hmm.
What is that? I mean, it sounds good.
How are you going to measure that?
He's just going to improve. He will.
I had one that was like, she will remain calm when feeling anxious. I was like, and how are you as a teacher going to measure that?
Oh, but she must go into IEP meetings all day.
Okay. Sorry, my baby's babying.
Jude is agreeing.
He is. Are civil Jude Oliver. Are civil liberties violated if a district does not implement or fulfill IEPs or 504s?
Civil liberties? Not really. Civil liberties have really nothing to do with it. We're talking about rights that they have under that particular law. And in your state, I mean, every state has their own version of IDEA. So you have state law you have to follow and federal law. It's not too difficult because most states just mirror the federal law. But
Yep.
civil liberties are not really a part of the puzzle or part of the.
Perfect. Okay, and our last one for the night. Somebody say stop.
Stop.
Okay. The district used the Wilson with my son for 2 years. He is now in the higher levels of Wilson and he has stopped making progress. Actually, he has regressed. The district did not have the teacher trained in Wilson beyond the 3-day introductory training. Would this fall under FAPE?
That's kind of iffy. Probably not. Training of teachers can be a part of the IEP. I mean, you could ask that the person that be included in the IEP, that the teacher be trained. But if teachers aren't trained, that may not have. It depends, I mean, if they don't provide good educational services because of it, that would be a FAPE thing. But just because they're not trained in a particular type of curriculum, that probably wouldn't.
And let me just piggyback on that. So I know that there's nobody more passionate than this dyslexia posse people. And I appreciate that. But it's my experience and Alicia and our partners that it's almost never that a child solely has dyslexia. Say it with me, almost never, which means, and so I find that people are very excited about Wilson or OG or Nyhouse or Texas Reading Institute. Well, it's a product, and the product is only as good as the person's hands it's in, and if they understand the kiddo's unique circumstances. And so, and those are general ed products, and I don't mind them, but if you don't also know that they have a fluency issue and ADHD inattentive, then I call it, when I train, you're drilling in the wrong place. And that's why in the beginning of any dyslexia handbook, it will tell you if they're truly dyslexic, when they start a dyslexia program that's research-based, it will be a game changer. And I think parents are so excited that they're in the dyslexia program. It's sort of like I have a membership to a gym. I don't go, right? So if it's not really making changes in dyslexia, listen to me. You need to pivot and do a full cognitive profile, all 7 Gs and 5 areas of academic achievement. And because you're doing one little tiny thing, one of the 9 SLDs. So that's a big deal.
Okay, we're done for the night, guys. Thank you all for attending. We
Are
appreciate
done for the night. Let's talk about Dr. Yell's next fiesta with us. And Dr. Yell, will you give us your email address, and Alicia will put it in the chat so people can contact you for training and webinars and
or if you have any questions. Yeah. myell.sc for South Carolina .edu. So just myell@sc.edu.
Okay, and then Dr. Yell is joining us again in 4 short weeks for impactful evaluations. I was thinking of something else, but impactful evaluations. Because really, if you don't have the right evaluations, you're not gonna. It's the foundation for all of the other things to serve kiddos with disabilities. So, Dr. Yell, thank you as always. Alicia, thank you to all of our friends that logged on. Thank you for you guys that are watching the recording. If there's anything we can do to serve you, just let us know at Advocate at Special Education Academy. We have trainings, we have digital products, we have on-demand products. We have a 2-day intensive live coming up in about 6 weeks. And then we have a group mastermind that we're starting the 1st of June. So avail yourself of that. If there's anything that we can do, just reach out to us at Advocate at SpecialEducationAcademy.com. And remember, when we get it right for the child, we get it right for everybody. And we'll see you guys in the next training.
Thank you.